The summer sun bore down on the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry as they marched steadily along the dusty road toward Gettysburg. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, leather, and gunpowder, carried by the faint breeze that rustled the leaves of the trees lining the path. At the head of the column, Sallie, a brindle American pitbull terrier with a proud gait and sharp eyes, trotted alongside Colonel Richard Coulter's horse. Her ears twitched at every sound, birdsong, distant cannon fire, or the rhythmic clinking of bayonets against cartridge boxes. "She's got more discipline than half the men in this regiment," grumbled Private Amos Grumpy McAllister, his voice rough like gravel. The cantankerous veteran adjusted his pack with a scowl, though his eyes softened as he watched Sallie weave through the ranks. If only she could carry a rifle. "She'd probably outshoot you," quipped Lieutenant William Terry, Sallie's original caretaker. The young officer gave McAllister a sly grin as he walked alongside him. "Besides, she's got a more important job, keeping you in line." McAllister snorted. "And the day I take orders from a dog is the day I start voting Democrat." The men around them chuckled, their spirits lifted by the familiar banter. Sallie paused to glance back at her comrades, her tail wagging slightly before she resumed her position at the front. She had been with the regiment since she was a pup, training alongside them in drills and maneuvers. She knew their routines as well as any soldier and had earned her place as their mascot and guardian. As they approached Gettysburg, a farmer standing by his fence watched the column pass. His eyes narrowed as he spotted Sallie trotting proudly at the front. "Does that dog bite?" he called out. Without missing a beat, McAllister shouted back, "Only women, rebels, and Democrats." The soldiers erupted into laughter, their voices carrying down the line like a wave of mirth. But the levity was short-lived. As they neared Seminary Ridge, distant cannon fire rumbled like thunder across the hills. The men fell silent, their faces growing grim. Sallie seemed to sense their unease. Her ears perked up, and she stayed close to Lieutenant Terry. By mid-afternoon on July 1st, they reached Oak Ridge and were ordered to take up defensive positions. The rolling fields ahead were dotted with Confederate skirmishers advancing under cover of musket fire. The sharp crack of rifles filled the air as Union soldiers scrambled into formation. Sallie barked furiously at the enemy lines but stayed close to the regimental colors, as she always did during battle. Her presence was a comfort to the men, a reminder of home and loyalty in the midst of chaos. "Hold steady," Colonel Coulter shouted over the din of gunfire. "Keep your lines tight." McAllister crouched behind a low stone wall, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. He glanced at Sallie and muttered under his breath, "Don't you get yourself shot now, girl." The battle raged for hours as Confederate forces pressed hard against Union positions on Oak Ridge. Despite their fierce resistance, the 11th Pennsylvania was eventually forced to retreat through Gettysburg under heavy fire. In the chaos of retreating through the narrow streets of Gettysburg, crowded with panicked soldiers and frightened civilians, Sallie became separated from her comrades. Amid the shouts of officers rallying their men and the rumble of artillery in the distance, she darted through alleyways and past fleeing troops. Confused by the noise and movement, she lost sight of the regimental colors she always followed. Instead of continuing toward Cemetery Hill with her regiment, instinct drew her back to Oak Ridge, the place where her comrades had fought so valiantly. There, surrounded by the fallen, she began her lonely vigil. As night fell over Gettysburg, Sallie stood alone on the ridge amidst fallen soldiers and shattered muskets. Her brindle coat blended into the shadows as she began her vigil over those who could no longer march beside her. Back at Cemetery Hill, McAllister paced anxiously near a campfire. His usual gruff demeanor was gone, worry etched deep lines into his weathered face. "You think she made it out?" Terry asked quietly. McAllister didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames before finally muttering, "She's tougher than all of us put together, but I'll be damned if I don't miss that dog already." The sound of distant cannon fire echoed through the night as both men fell silent, each hoping that somewhere out there Sallie was safe. The dawn of July 2nd broke over Gettysburg, casting a pale light across the fields and ridges that had been transformed by the chaos of battle. Smoke still lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy scent of trampled grass and scorched wood. On Oak Ridge, now firmly in Confederate hands, Sallie stood alone. Her brindle coat was streaked with dirt, her paws sore from running over rocky ground during the confusion of the previous day. Yet she remained steadfast, her dark eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for her comrades to return. Around her lay the fallen, men from the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry who had fought bravely to hold their position. Some still clung to life, groaning softly in pain, while others lay silent and still. Sallie moved among them with quiet determination. She licked the wounds of those who were injured, her gentle touch offering a strange kind of comfort in their final moments. For the dead she stood watch, her small frame a sentinel against the encroaching darkness. Confederate soldiers occasionally passed by as they secured their new positions. At first they regarded Sallie with suspicion, rifles raised in case she posed a threat, but as they drew closer, they saw her purpose, her loyalty, and left her undisturbed. One young Confederate soldier paused to watch her as she lay beside a fallen Union soldier, resting her head on his arm as if to guard him even in death. "Poor thing," he muttered to himself before moving on. For 3 days, Sallie stayed on Oak Ridge. She refused food from passing soldiers and drank only from a muddy puddle nearby. Her once proud stance grew weary, but she never abandoned her post. Meanwhile, back at Cemetery Hill, the men of the 11th Pennsylvania Infantry prepared for another day of fighting. The mood was somber. They had suffered heavy losses on July 1st and knew more bloodshed awaited them. Private Amos McAllister sat near a campfire, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. "She's out there somewhere," Lieutenant Terry said as he sat down beside McAllister. "You know how smart she is. She'll find her way back." McAllister didn't respond immediately, his stare distant, his jaw tight. Finally he muttered, "She's got more sense than most men I know, but this ain't no place for a dog." Terry smiled faintly. "No place for any of us." The two men fell silent as cannon fire echoed in the distance. It wasn't until July 4th, after Confederate forces retreated from Gettysburg, that Sallie's vigil came to an end. A soldier from another brigade stumbled upon her while searching Oak Ridge for survivors. He froze when he saw her standing amidst the carnage, her brindle coat thin and matted but her posture resolute. "Well, I'll be," he whispered as he approached cautiously. "You've been here all this time?" Sallie didn't bark or growl. She simply looked at him with tired eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. The soldier knelt down and extended his hand. "Come on now," he said gently. "Let's get you back where you belong." At first, Sallie hesitated, glancing back at the bodies she had been guarding. But something in the man's voice, kind and reassuring, convinced her to follow him. When Sallie was brought back to Cemetery Hill later that day, the men gathered around her, cheering and laughing despite their exhaustion and grief. McAllister pushed his way through the crowd, his face a mixture of relief and irritation. "Where in blazes have you been?" he demanded gruffly as he knelt beside her. Sallie wagged her tail weakly and licked his hand. McAllister's voice softened as he scratched behind her ears. Lieutenant Terry chuckled as he handed McAllister a piece of hardtack soaked in water for Sallie to eat. "Admit it, you missed her." McAllister shot him a glare but didn't deny it. As twilight drifted over Cemetery Hill, the men settled down to rest before whatever trials awaited them next. Sallie lay curled up beside McAllister near the fire, her head resting on his lap as he absent-mindedly stroked her fur. "You're tougher than all of us put together," McAllister muttered under his breath. "But don't you ever scare me like that again." Sallie let out a contented sigh and closed her eyes. For all the horrors they had witnessed over those 3 days in Gettysburg, the screams of battle, the loss of friends, the sight of Sallie's unwavering loyalty reminded them of something greater, courage not bound by rank or species but by love and duty. As McAllister leaned back against his pack, fireflies danced silently around them, their soft green gold lights drifting through the warm summer night. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, as if the heavens themselves had opened to guide the souls of the men who had given their last full measure of devotion. McAllister watched the tiny lights drift lazily through the air, their glow a quiet reminder of life's fragile beauty amidst so much loss. He glanced down at Sallie, curled up beside him, her head resting on his lap. Stroking her brindle coat, he murmured softly so only she could hear, "You're one hell of a soldier." Sallie's ears twitched slightly, and a single firefly landed briefly on her ear before lifting off into the night, its light rising toward the stars as though it too carried a piece of something eternal. McAllister let out a long breath and closed his eyes, comforted by Sallie's steady presence as darkness settled over the battlefield.